In the world of music criticism, albums can be judged in countless ways. Journalists and reviewers are free to shower a record with praise or tear it apart with a single sharp paragraph. Yet, almost always, there is one judgment that carries far more weight than any review: the judgment of the person who created the work in the first place. In many cases, the creator becomes the most ruthless critic, and in the case of Paul McCartney, this is not merely a psychological tendency, but a consequence of artistic standards that are nearly inhuman. To be Paul McCartney is to live under the shadow of one's own work. Perfectionism, doubt, and the weight of a legendary name. It is far easier to be critical of your own work than of someone else's. That is human nature. We know every compromise that was made, every idea that never fully developed, every line of lyric that could have been sharper. Even for a songwriter of Paul McCartney's stature, whose catalog includes hundreds of classic songs across generations, moments of self-doubt still arrive. McCartney is not just a productive musician, he is a symbol. Every song he released after the Beatles was automatically measured against Yesterday, Hey Jude, or Let It Be. There was no safe space, no comfort zone. And although in the later years of the Beatles, McCartney often became the driving force in the studio, shaping arrangements, pushing experimentation, and completing songs, he was still operating within a collective structure. The Beatles, for all their internal conflicts, still provided a kind of psychological shelter. The security of a band and the risk of standing alone. As long as he was in the Beatles, the creative burden never rested entirely on his own shoulders. Even in extreme situations, such as the 1966 incident in the Philippines, when the band unintentionally offended the regime of Imelda Marcos and had to flee the country, McCartney was not alone. There were three others sharing the pressure, fear, and chaos. After the Beatles broke up, that reality changed dramatically. When Paul McCartney stepped out as a solo artist and later formed Wings, every artistic decision pointed back to a single name: Paul McCartney. Although Wings was a band, the public and the media never truly perceived it as such. McCartney's name always appeared first, larger and more dominant. Praise was directed at him. Failure belonged entirely to him as well. The pressure to match an impossible past. For more than 5 decades, McCartney has lived under constant pressure to create something that could rival his Beatles-era work, a task that, realistically, is nearly impossible. When extraordinary albums like Ram came along, they were not immediately understood, but time eventually acted fairly. The album was rehabilitated, reappraised, and is now regarded as one of Paul McCartney's finest achievements outside the Beatles. By contrast, albums that landed in the territory of being merely good enough or too safe were judged far more harshly, not only by critics, but by McCartney himself. These records did not fail spectacularly, and that was precisely the problem. Back to the Egg, an album that wasn't bad, but wasn't satisfying. One of the clearest examples of this dynamic is Back to the Egg, the Wings album released in 1979, and, ironically, the band's final album. It would be difficult to objectively describe Back to the Egg as a bad record. It is not chaotic, not careless, not embarrassing. Yet upon its release, the response from both the public and critics was largely lukewarm. There was little enthusiasm, no narrative of resurgence, no sense of importance. By this point, McCartney had already spent more than 2 decades at the center of the global music industry. He had written hundreds of songs, produced album after album, and continuously adapted to changing musical eras. Creative fatigue was almost inevitable. And on Back to the Egg, that fatigue can be felt. McCartney was not at the peak of his songwriting powers, and although Wings attempted to compensate musically, their instrumental performances were not strong enough to fully cover the gaps in inspiration across parts of the album. Awareness of failure from the very beginning. Most revealing of all, McCartney was aware of this even before the album was released. In a 1997 interview with Guitar World, he revealed that the disappointment had already taken hold during the production stage. "Linda and I were so disappointed, thinking, God, this is a really terrible record." This statement reveals something rarely seen, the brutal honesty of a legend confronting his own work. And this judgment did not exist in isolation. Many music critics in 1979 shared similar views, even if they expressed them in more restrained language. Time, distance, and emotional reassessment. Time, however, has a way of softening memory. Decades after Wings had ended, McCartney found an opportunity to listen to Back to the Egg again, without pressure, without expectation, and without the emotional weight of its original reception. He listened not as Paul McCartney the icon, but as someone looking back. "My son pulled it out recently, and it's really not as bad as I thought it was," he admitted. This was not a defense, nor was it a declaration of rediscovered greatness. It was a calm acceptance. Lyrics, laziness, and radical honesty. McCartney remained critical. He acknowledged that if there was an area where his work tended to slip, it was usually in the lyrics, not in melody, not in arrangement. "It's not easy to do your tightest, most succinct work all the time," he said, "and if there is a drop, it's probably in the lyrics." Most striking was his honesty about the cause. "I hate to tell you, but I put a lot of it down to laziness, where I just thought, yeah, that'll do. And in mitigation, I think that sometimes I probably was right." It was a rare reflection from a great artist, an admission that not every piece of work is born from the same creative fire, and that not every compromise is an outright failure. Seen within the full context of McCartney's extraordinary career, from the early days in Hamburg through the heights of Beatlemania, the emotional collapse following the Beatles' breakup, and the long decades as a solo artist, Back to the Egg reads more accurately as a document of creative exhaustion than of artistic failure. It may not have been the grand farewell on the scale of Abbey Road that Wings arguably deserved, but when compared with many of the albums filling the charts in 1979, Back to the Egg still stands as the more daring, more musical, and more honest work. In the end, perhaps the greatest reason this album was hated by McCartney was not its quality, but its creator. When you are Paul McCartney, the standard of good enough often feels like failure. And that is where Back to the Egg finds its most human place.